Thank you, Valerie. It's an honor to be asked, a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I'll offer a few reflections that I've come to over the last many years, but particularly the last number, around this idea of the voices from the outside, and reflecting on it, particularly from my work in working on poverty reduction, and those people that we think about as being poor. And I think that flows nicely from the talk that we just had about the labels that we assign to people and what that means. To begin, I never knew my grandmother, not really. She died almost 50 years ago, and I'll date myself because I was almost 5 at the time. The only thing that I have of her is a picture of her in her backyard feeding a crow. This was a crow that the neighbor had actually raised from a fledgling, and he'd split its tongue so that it learned how to talk. So she's feeding this talking crow. My grandmother loved that crow. She had developed a good relationship with it, but my grandfather, who was a painter, he hated the thing because the crow got into his shop and he used to crap all over his paintings. But Grandma seemed to love it. She was relatively young when she died, and the symptoms came on gradually. At first, she hardly noticed it. She'd been feeling tired, and she started getting some headaches. She thought she just needed some rest. But the headaches persisted, and then they got progressively worse, and eventually she went to see the doctor. The doctor said, it's a headache. Take some aspirin and get some more rest, which she did. But after a while, the aspirin no longer worked either. The doctor told her she was just being weak and said she needed more rest and to ignore it. So she did. And then her vision and her balance became impaired. And the doctor told her to stop complaining and just take more rest. After all, we all get headaches. And when my mother eventually found her crawling across the floor because she could no longer walk because of the pain, they finally got her a referral to a specialist in the city. But by then it was too late. The tumor in her brain had grown so large it was barely operable, and she died on the operating table. We learned later that this is a genetic trait that we all carry in the family, so we've learned to pay a lot of attention to symptoms. And symptoms are important because they tell us something about our condition. But we must never fail to distinguish between symptoms and cause. And like any disease, poverty, too, presents us with symptoms. And like a disease, it's important not to confuse the symptoms and the cause. We talk a lot about poverty, but what is it actually? Well, Canada doesn't have an official definition of poverty, but Statistics Canada has provided us with something called the low-income cutoff, which we kind of use as a poverty definition. And the definition of low income, according to this, is the income below which a family is likely to spend 20 percentage points more of its income on food, shelter, and clothing than the average family. So we infer from this something about the nature of poverty. It has to do with income and our ability to meet our basic needs like food, shelter, clothing, and so on. A few years ago, I had the privilege of working on the Mayor's Task Force on Poverty Reduction. And in that work, we asked people what poverty was. We didn't want to define it for them. We wanted them to tell us. And we just went to the community. We went to church basements and community associations, community halls. And we asked people that question, and they came up with words like expensive, homelessness, inequality, debt, dark, bleak, blame, mean, lonely, violent, unjust, divided. We could say these are symptoms, but symptoms of what? They describe this condition we call poverty, but they don't tell us exactly what it is. And it's interesting that very few of those words that they came back with had anything at all to do with money. We could, and many people do, assume that the symptoms we described are in fact symptoms of a lack of money. And if we take that definition of poverty and we look at those who suffer from a lack of money, we see that those who suffer from a lack of money also experience many of those things, but many people with money also experience many of those symptoms. So my question is, what if the lack of money wasn't the cause? But what if the lack of money is itself a symptom? And what if, like the headaches and the fatigue that my grandmother was experiencing, all of these are pointing us to something much deeper? If so, our attempts to treat poverty with money are kind of like trying to treat that brain tumor with aspirin. If we want to get to the root of poverty, I suggest we look back, and I mean way back. As a person of faith and working in a faith-based institution, I dabble a little bit in the practice of theology, so bear with me. One of the reasons that appeals to me, though, is because our religious traditions have had a lot to say about poverty over the millennia. If we look at the sacred text in the Judeo-Christian tradition, that's the tradition I'm most familiar with, we find that there are 4 groups of people who are always referred to almost synonymously as the poor. These are the widow, the alien, the afflicted, and the fatherless. And I'd like to suggest that we consider these 4 groups of people as archetypes. And let's examine these archetypes to see if they have anything at all to tell us about the nature of poverty. So we'll start with the widow. Who is the widow? Well, first of all, the widow is a woman. She's been cut off by death from the primary relationship that sustained her. As a woman in that society, she would have been prohibited from paid work or owning property. She would have been voiceless, cut off from both the religious and political establishment that would have given power. Her relationships now and before were ones of dependence. So she grieves, but not only for the person that she's lost. She grieves for herself, for the loss of the social structure that sheltered her. She grieves for the loss of her tenuous connection to any source of power. The alien. Who is the alien? The alien is the one who doesn't belong. The alien was the foreigner, landless, prevented from getting land. The alien wore funny clothes, ate disgusting food, spoke a funny language, and worshipped crazy gods. The alien worked for cheap wages, easy to exploit, really. And if something went wrong, well, they couldn't just go home, back to where they came from. Maybe they should anyways. This was, after all, our promised land. The afflicted. The afflicted bears the weight of his or her body's failures. The afflicted is old, or the afflicted is young, or the afflicted worked a farm or held down a good job until the accident or illness or the voices in the head got too loud. If the afflicted was a man, he bore the blame of not providing and the shame of his failing social standing. If the afflicted was a woman, she bore the burden and shame of not being able to care for her family. And they both suffer under the weight not only of their physical limitations and pain, but even more so the shame of their growing dependence. And lastly, the fatherless. The fatherless is the one without a family. The fatherless is the child you'll meet every day on the street downtown. Are they fatherless because their father died or because their father left? Perhaps the fatherless now bears the duty of supporting the family. The fatherless becomes the father too early, too young. Childhood evaporates as the responsibilities of being an adult are laid on them. Or are they fatherless because they left, because the father beat them, and they ran out of anger or fear, or both? Maybe they were no longer welcome at home because of how they looked, or who they loved, or what they wore or said. The fatherless has no home, no guidance, no access to the family name or inheritance, and the fatherless is alone in the world. Interesting if we take those four as archetypes from over 2,000 years ago, going back maybe even 3,000 years, we find that nothing has changed. Because if we look at who is poor in Canada and Calgary right now, it's overwhelmingly lone parent families, single people, immigrants, Aboriginal persons, persons with disabilities, in short, the widow, the alien, the afflicted, and the fatherless. So if we reflect on these groups of people and think about what they have in common, it might tell us a little bit about the nature of poverty. I think they have three things in common. First of all, they're powerless. And I don't believe that people lack power because they're poor. I believe people are poor because they lack power. Privilege tends to reinforce itself. I benefit from systems that pave roads for me that others have to continually pave for themselves. Secondly, those groups of people are the ones who are different. As human beings, we're very good at building walls, at establishing boundaries between us and them, determining who's in and who is out. And our capacity to distinguish between us and them seems almost unlimited. We distinguish on the basis of color, gender, ability, religion, even between the poor and the non-poor, as though we were separate species. And so we reinforce those patterns of power that make people different and keep them powerless. And in fear, we build walls to hold on to our own power and privilege. Lastly, those groups of people are alone. In ancient society, to be widowed, foreign, afflicted, fatherless was to be cut off. It was to be outside of the structures of community and family and society that sustained people. And today, things aren't all that much different. During 2013, when the floods came, I was working for the city, and I was working in the reception centers that we set up to accommodate people who'd been displaced from their homes. Interestingly, about 100,000 people were displaced, about the same number as live in poverty in Calgary every single day. Of that 100,000, we only needed to find shelter for 2,000 of those people. The rest were all taken care of. But those 2,000 people that came to those reception centers had one thing in common, and that was that they were almost invariably alone. I asked people, is there an emergency contact person you can give us? They said, nope. Is there can we release information about you to somebody who might be looking for you? They said, nobody's going to be looking. But I think there's one further thing that these groups of people have in common. And that thing is that they are us. We hold this myth about the independent, self-reliant person. It's the ideal that we hold ourselves up against. And it's a myth because the wholly independent person doesn't exist. They, like the widow, the alien, the afflicted, and the fatherless, are an archetype that we construct. And we know deeply that we are not that self-reliant person. We enter life vulnerable as children, and we leave vulnerable in our age or infirmity. We strive being independent, yet we fear being alone. We amass wealth as we wrestle with the fear of not having enough. We project strength as we grapple with the knowledge of our own vulnerability. And we struggle with our difference as we strive to be accepted. And in our fear of all of this, we grasp for power and build the walls that continue to divide us. And now we come to the root of poverty. Working on the mayor's task force, I had the opportunity of speaking with some folks who were living in a shelter downtown. I asked them, what's the biggest issue that's facing you as a person in deep poverty, homeless, living in a shelter? They didn't say anything about money. They didn't say anything about food. They didn't say anything about housing. They said, my biggest issue is my lack of rights. It was about not being treated as a human being with dignity. It was about being powerless, being different, being excluded, and being alone. It was about all the things that you and I also fear. So fear is at the heart of poverty. This is actually a clinical fear of poverty. It's called peniophobia, and it's the fear of being in poverty as well as the fear of poor people. And I think peniophobia is poverty itself. In our fear, we assign labels that divide. We separate ourselves into the poor and the non-poor, and in so doing, we create the conditions that we most desperately fear. Because if being poor is being powerless, different, and alone, then creating the structures that reinforce power, difference, and exclusion is at the root of poverty, and money is not going to solve it. And so we return to the beginning. So what if the lack of money is a symptom of something deeper? If that something deeper is the powerlessness, divisions, and exclusion inherent in our culture, then our definitions are all wrong. And we won't heal poverty until we heal the wounds that divide us and heal our fractured relationships. For if poverty is fundamentally about our fractured relationships, it's not a question of helping the poor, because we're all poor, because we're all affected by those fractured relationships. So what do we do about poverty? I think the first thing we need to do is stop trying to fix it, because when we try to fix something, we're trying to do something to someone or something else. It's manipulative, it involves power relationships, it involves technical knowledge that tries to do to others or other things. And it assumes we have some power or ability to control it. So when we try to fix stuff, we end up recreating the exact conditions we are attempting to fix by categorizing people, like the poor, and using our power to manipulate and control. So rather than fixing poverty, I propose we need to think about healing it. Because if poverty is a wound, woundedness requires healing. And healing involves all of us because we're all wounded, and we all need to heal. It involves moving beyond the distinctions and power relations that divide, and instead it calls out to us to reach out to each other and rebuild the bonds of trust that are the foundation of our community life. And it is in community that we find resilience. When the flood came, it was the strength of community that got us through that. Those who found themselves outside of community and alone were the ones who struggled the most. It's the strength of the relationships we forge around us that allows us to adapt and even thrive in the midst of crisis and change. So we build resilience in ourselves and in our community by nurturing relationships of trust between ourselves, and especially with those who are different, powerless, marginalized, and alone. When we have nurtured a resilient community, resources suddenly start to appear. When we live in fear of each other or fear of not having enough, we live in scarcity. And our scarcity grows with our fear. When we live in trust, scarcity tends to disappear. Trust allows us to build and do together the things we cannot do alone. It allows us to share with our neighbors and not be concerned about our liabilities or losses. Where fear asks us to consider and manage the risks, trust gives us permission to take risks and even to innovate. And so we learn from our successes and our failures. Trust allows us to share power and empower others, and that unleashes the creative potential that's within all of us. So I ask you to consider, in closing, these three principles of community: abundance, resilience, and trust. And together, they give us this beautiful acronym, ART. Abundance, resilience, and trust. Because building community together is an art. It's not a science. It's the art of healing. It is the art of hope. And when we focus on these things, we start to heal poverty, and we heal the tumor rather than fixing the headache. And we build a community where we're all healed, and the community where we all can thrive. And in so doing, we also heal poverty, almost by accident. Thank you.